Did you want me to talk just briefly over the blue zones quickly?
Yeah, let's bring that piece in again, high level, because it's important to fully understand what we've been discussing.
Okay, so high level. Michel Pula and Giovanni Pes, he was a physician researcher in Italy, and he uncovered and presented in 1999 to a longevity conference this area that he was looking at in Sardinia, about 900 meters above sea level, where he believed he'd found an exceptional group of isolated, they hadn't had Western food introduced to them. They were still living very simple lives. They were shepherding. They were raising their own food, hunting, gathering. It was seasonal. It was in rhythm, and it was resourcing the next generation, as I'm really passionate about. And he took this to the conference and said, maybe there's a genetic reason for this because they've been isolated for so long. Maybe they have some exceptional genetic variant that we could look at to see if we can replicate. Anyway, he was bagged out, apparently, this conference. A lot of people poo-pooed him, and except for a guy called Michel Pula. He was a Belgian demographer. And he came across and he wanted to really look at this and get age validation. He wanted to do all sorts of things. But the more and more they looked into it, and I'll say it was the original blue zone because they were using a blue highlighter pen to circle this very small area in Sardinia, and the blue zone revealed itself. So they started to understand there didn't appear to be a genetic component. It really appeared that these people, it was the place they were in. It was a longevity area. They were longevity people. So they were doing some studies. It became the IKEA study. And similar time, studies were being done in Okinawa by Makoto Suzuki. And he was looking at the longevity of Okinawans, thinking, again, a genetic aberrant because these people have got incredible longevity. He went there in 1976, I believe, from Tokyo. And he just discovered, he was a gerontologist, and he discovered more and more people with exceptional longevity. And he was looking at their birth certificates and the kaseki, which is the birth certificates, marriage certificates, and death certificates handwritten in Japan at the time, and just was quite mind blown. So Dan Buettner had heard about this, and he pitched the quest to National Geographic in 2004 and said, can I go in search of the secrets of longevity, which is what the title of the front cover was in the National Geographic in 2005. So he included Okinawa and Sardinia, but he says that the editor said, well, this is great. We've got these people who are potentially the poorest and the least educated in their respective nations. They're living off the land. They are looking after themselves. They're spending a lot of time in the sun. How are we going to sell this to Americans? You need an American city. Obviously, the Adventist health studies were being published, and maybe he was aware of that. So it would have potentially tied in as to why Dan Buettner chose Loma Linda as the third blue zone in his investigation and in his National Geographic article. But Loma Linda is so different, Jessie, to those two, and also to Ikaria and Nicoya, which became the 5 blue zones over time, where again, these people learned how to prepare foods traditionally, preserve foods, nixtamalization, I worked it out from the last one, of corn. They had the wisdom passed down through generations. Loma Linda was an abandoned hotel originally, the Mound City Hotel. Mound City, 1,000 railway workers were living there while they were laying the railway tracks. There were 5.5 million orange trees under cultivation underneath that Mound City Hotel. But when the railway tracks were finished and the workers moved away, 2 lots of investors tried to do something with this incredibly large and grand and magnificent hotel. And I guess the hilltop dream faded. until 1905, when Ellen G. White heard about it and told the church she had seen this exact place in visions a few years ago. This was what they had to purchase, and they got it at a bargain price because it had sat empty for years. And within months of moving in there, they had the sanitarium set up, they were training nurses. By 1909, they were training the College of Medical Evangelists, they were training doctors to be missionaries. She'd already set the school system up in 1906, and currently they state they've got about 1,300 students in that school, and 97% of the students will graduate and go to tertiary education. Even just that is such a disconnect between the other areas. The College of Medical Evangelists became Loma Linda University Medical Center. And if you look at that structure, it is stories high, a glass building. It just sits like a statue in the middle of the landscape. Nothing like that in any of the other blue zones. Certainly not the traditional blue zones, the ones that they're trying to recreate and sell to us as a longevity pill. So we're talking about the second biggest educator in the world, even though they've got that really small membership. Second biggest educator. They are also the second largest Protestant healthcare providers in the world. And I mentioned before, there's, I think about there are 34 hospitals in Florida alone, but the healthcare system in America is massive under the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And yes, now they've bought the blue zones. The American College of Lifestyle Medicine is training doctors throughout America. Do you know, the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, did I talk about the White House conference on hunger, nutrition and health last time?
No, you didn't.
So the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, when they heard about this, they were saying, we would like to offer hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of resources to help this conference. We'll provide education resources for this many doctors and this many participants. But when I went back and had a look, their donation to the White House conference on hunger, nutrition and health was a very small portion of pre-created educational materials that were fairly, not say bland, they were nice, but they weren't strict about what their beliefs were. And they were offering it to these. So in effect, it didn't cost them anything. They just had to give the unlock key. They just had to give the link to how 200,000 doctors that they offered the free resource to. And my concern, and I spoke to Judy Cho about this in 2020, was that this idea meant they could potentially have the most incredible windfall, because all they needed was even say half of those doctors to say, maybe I'll try another educational resource and pay for it. Maybe I'll go to a conference. Maybe I'll become a member. Their windfall could be in the millions, Jessie. So it's like the blue zones. Now they're accrediting people. They're accrediting cities. So I think there are 75 cities currently accredited as blue zones, but the church owned that franchise. And in 2018, I found a document saying it was almost $7 million US for accreditation for that community. And then you've got to keep paying the accreditation fees. And I've read some people say that the metrics have been slightly confusing and tweaked to make it look better than it actually is. And the costs are quite prohibitive. I spoke to a guy in America that said they had Tony Butner, I believe, or maybe it was Nick, come and speak to them about potentially becoming a blue zone. And it cost them, I think, $20,000 just to have him come and talk before they even signed up for anything. And I just think the amount of money the church must be making from corporate wellness, wellness tourism, medical education, this belief, their healthcare reform message at this point in time is phenomenal. So if you consider that there are currently 36 patents pending since the church have bought it, for more merchandise, for more food products, for, I think there's even a water, for real estate, and for wellness tourism to still go through. Like, their ability to commercialize these products has erased what their foundations were. The 7 countries, the 22 countries, the Mediterranean diet was not Crete's orthodox fasting diet. I explained to you, they're so different. 22 states border and sit within that space. This isn't a single diet, and the same with the blue zones. They're so diverse, and they rely on ancestral nourishment of animal foods and plant foods, preserved and fermented and cultured so that they are the healthiest, and I guess so that they can keep eating them. This isn't processed food that's made in a factory, which is what the Seventh-day Adventist Church sells.
To me, to get any value out of this Blue Zones thing, we need to remember there's a lot of money at the foundation and religion. But given that, to me, we have to parse out a couple of different things. One, are these people actually living the longest? And 2, if they are, what are they actually eating and doing? Because we've already in our last chat went deep into the fact that the 4 traditional blue zones all rely on pigs. So there's a lot of different pieces. That's just one of the pieces.
And it's a very important piece.
Right. But my point here is, let's take each of those pillars. Do we know if in any of the blue zones, these people are scientifically actually living longer?
In Sardinia, Michel Pula has published in 2024 an article showing a graph that the age validation of 40 Sardinians, and he said at the time when they did it, there was more, but he has shown that the age validation of these particular centenarians and super centenarians in Sardinia with very good, administration has shown that these people potentially were that age and had survived, but it doesn't talk about anyone who may have left. It doesn't talk about survivorship, how many people actually passed away. These may be incredibly healthy people that have survived. They live within a close family unit and they live as a very valued member. They still have purpose within their lives. They move. They're in rocky, mountainous regions. So to get from one house to another, they have to still be climbing hills. I think Sardinia potentially was an area. Is it still? No. They had this, what do they call it? Something like a nutrition transition. I think Giovanni Pes and Michel Pula specifically clarify this. Nutrition transition occurred in the lower areas of Italy and Sardinia in particular in about the 1970s. But it happened much later up in the mountains, just purely because of the way they were living and access to these places. It just happened a lot later. So was their longevity due to this later development of potentially having better medication? Maybe some, I couldn't call any industrial food good, but maybe they were starting to get some fortification supplementation. And the lack of nursing homes, the lack of, people didn't go to hospital. They were looked after so much more. They went there for emergencies, but most people were tended and cared for at home. They weren't being told we need to medicate, operate, do all these things like America and Australia. And again, this nutrition transition was when a lot of this idea that medicating people, working out baselines. If you had high blood pressure, if you had this, you had that. It was happening a lot around that same time in the 1970s. But the nutrition in the lower lands of Sardinia, they were getting a lot of Western food come in the 70s. So there still seems to be a small group that is surviving and maybe trying to get back and relive and really, teach the younger generations how to still prepare foods and look after themselves. But in Okinawa, no way. The Okinawans are now, and I think I spoke about the Kaseki, so their birth, deaths, and marriage registry, which potentially Makoto Suzuki accessed, had been rewritten by the occupying Americans at the time, the military, because 93% of their buildings were destroyed, and most of the Kaseki, their handwritten Kaseki, were in their houses, and they were also destroyed. So in 1949, the Americans re-established them. And we're talking about a group of people who lost a third of the civilians in World War II, the Battle of Okinawa. Their livelihood was destroyed, their crops were destroyed. They had 100,000 pigs pre-war, and after war there was only 800. So we're talking about people who are starving, again, like in Crete. And can you blame someone if they said that they were born 20 years earlier? Maybe we'll say 10. But interestingly, in Okinawa, suddenly there were a lot of people living to 115. So when Makoto Suzuki was seeing them, they were in their 90s and potentially getting into their hundreds. But we're talking later, suddenly 115, who has this many supercentenarians living? You have to start to question. And when the Japanese government went looking, they found 230 centenarians were missing, but their families were still getting their pensions. So there's a lot of crossover between altering their pensions because of horrific conditions. So I'm not really blaming anyone for doing that. And also people, because they were so poor and they were able to access pensions for a lot longer. So they weren't checking up on these people to see that they were still alive. I guess that's the point. Now Okinawa has been called the most obese and the shortest lifespan because Western food came in the 1940s, 1950s. By 1950, I say Coca-Cola bottling plant was sitting off the coast of Okinawa, and as soon as the American invasion, as soon as America took possession of Okinawa, Coca-Cola moved their bottling plant in. So we're talking about Coca-Cola, we're talking about McDonald's, we're talking about Kentucky Fried Chicken. All of these industries have moved into this space. There's something like 32 military bases still on Okinawa, taking up 25% of its land. We've got a lot of military presence from America and Japan still there, even though America gave it back to Japan in the 1970s. So the American influence and the American food influence is huge and potentially has worked its way into a metabolic dysfunctional group as it has anywhere in the Western world that we're eating this highly processed food. So that is there, and these people have not got that longevity advantage anymore. In Ikaria, the elderly people are dying out. And because so many roads have been put in and tourism has been created, health resorts, people are going there wanting to see how to live to 100. I told you it's a tiny rocky island, and it only sustains 8,000 people to live there when they did the 2007 study. 35,000 goats. They've had to take away areas that these people could traditionally move their animals around and take goats down to the beach and take them up to the rocky areas at different seasons. They can't access those areas anymore. And the people going there want to eat plants. They don't want to eat their traditional foods. They don't want to eat the Christmas hog. They don't want to eat that rendered lard all year that helped these people survive when they weren't fasting. And I truly think that Ikaria is becoming, it's losing its ability to be called a blue zone because there aren't any aren't significant numbers of elderly people there anymore. In Nagoya, again, you've got the food industry coming in. You've got regulations about where they can fish because when you bring a whole lot of people in for tourism, you've got to create coastlines that are stunning that they can visit. You don't want traditional people coming along and fishing there and doing this. So their environment is being restricted by the tourism industry. And the Seventh-day Adventist Church now own a food factory in Costa Rica. So they're providing food which will take the place of flesh, meat, eggs, milk and butter. It's very complicated. And if you think about where the blue zones, the church-owned blue zones, are now running these wellness tourism spots in Thailand and in Costa Rica, in Nicaria, they're charging huge amounts. You can even go to a blue zone wellness retreat in New York City. But what I don't get is you're trying to go and see where all these people are living longer lives, and you've got Loma Linda in America. So are they living longer lives there? The Adventist health studies have been presented. There's 3 Adventist health studies, and they've cited themselves over and over and over again. And if you listen to Michael Orlick, who's one of the lead investigators, he said it was life expectancy based and disease prevention based. It was never actually age validation. And while there were some people in the original documentary that Dan Buttner presented who were significant or seriously healthy in their 90s, in their working still into their 90s, even they, if you listen to the documentary and go back or listen to other interviews, they talk about eating fish or cheeses and milks. Again, that fine print in the Adventist health studies. You can be vegetarian but still eat those things once a week, but you want to call yourself a vegetarian, you want to call yourself a vegan because that is your identity in this church. And the 2023 Netflix documentary, the people Dan Buttner interviewed were only in their 80s. And I'm not criticizing their age and their health and their wellness, and they had incredible vitality and a great deal of purpose, but they were in their 80s. And we were led to believe this whole thing about the blue zones is how to live to 100.
All right, so the age is sketchy. The diet, we know there's holes there.
Oh, yes, and sorry, the Seventh-day Adventist Church ban pork. Like Judaism and Islam, they ban pork. They consider it unclean. They pretty much ban all meats doctrinally, but in particular, shellfish and pork, which is a staple for fasting Greek Orthodox. Sorry, I had forgotten to say that bit, sorry.
No, that's great. And the last piece I was going to throw out is the fact that the Westerners now, with the infrastructure and the momentum behind this Blue Zones brand,
Yes.
is going in and changing the landscape.
Yes.
And ruining it for research and, more importantly, the people living there.
I truly believe that. I am really concerned that we're searching for longevity and it's becoming, the Blue Zones brand in particular, is becoming a purchasable item. We're trying to buy longevity. We're trying to buy not only what we have been told from this Power 9, the cherry-picked bits out of all of these cultures, but the diet is Loma Linda. The cherry-picked diet, we're trying to capture that. We're trying to pay for it. We're trying to move into a place, but this is for people who are wealthy. What about the poor? Okay, they're taking these Blue Zone city makeovers into whole communities to try and change the landscape, but they're also trying to get rid of meat, which I've spoken about. They tried to get rid of meat out of the restaurants, out of schools, out of groceries, that put them further and further back and highlight the plants. They also want to get other churches on board. This is part of the mission. And if you can get churches talking about it, we're going to jump right back here to 2000. The man who started the Australian Lifestyle Medicine Association, which became the Australasian Society of Lifestyle Medicine, ALMA, Gary Egger, he spoke in 2000 for ILSI, the International International Life Sciences Institute, which I talked before was founded by Alex Malaspina, the then vice president of Coca-Cola. So this group was actually food and pharmaceutical industries. It was actually tobacco at the beginning, a whole lot of things. So Gary Egger was talking for ILSI and the World Health Organization, and he presented a paper discussing the way to get rid of unhealthy food in the South Pacific, which is very important to me because this is my neighbor. So in the South Pacific, when he determined what was unhealthy food, he only spoke about fatty meat. Because, of course, again, the South Pacific early in 2000 didn't have a lot of Western food in it. So they wanted to get rid of the fatty meats that were there because they believed that was causing type 2 diabetes. And again, back in 2000, it was minimal, metabolically unhealthy, but they already had Coca-Cola. They already had Coca-Cola cheaper to buy than bottled water in a lot of the South Pacific countries. They already had sanitariums selling a lot of their foods over there. I don't believe he was a Seventh-day Adventist, but he spoke and said, we need to get rid of unhealthy food, and the way to do that is to use the church. Because people come to the church. The South Pacific peoples are very devoutly religious. They've had a lot of missionary people go and land over the last couple of 100 years and bring religion with them. But when the Adventists moved in, they brought not only education but healthcare. They're entering wedge into these places. And if you consider in the South Pacific that you're going in there, I spoke to someone recently who told me he'd visited a couple of the places a lot, and originally the education from the Seventh-day Adventist Church was trade. They actually helped them learn how to be self-sustaining. But in the last 15 or so years, it's become high-level education. It's become academia, medical, nursing, dietetic, and it's become government. They've trained them to move into these positions of power. And these people are grateful because they may have been poor and having to work really, really hard. And instead now you've got James Marape, and he is the president of Papua New Guinea, the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea. He has said in his opening speech, he now has an opportunity to take his religious beliefs into places he could never do before. That's pretty powerful, Jessie. When I was doing some studies back in 2018, 2019, 7 presidents and prime ministers of South Pacific countries were Seventh-day Adventist. James Marape the year before, did a mission for Christ. But he didn't say the mission for Christ was mission for Seventh-day Adventists version of Christ. And they baptized 300,000 people in Papua New Guinea for the church. And that mission for Christ is coming throughout the South Pacific. They're running it in different countries. And eventually in 2027, I think it's coming to Australia. But you think about that. I spoke at a Nourishing Australia event last year, which is really promoting regenerative agriculture and the concept of animals being so important for soil health, but also how do you replant and how do you culture the land, I guess, to recapture water? How do you make it viable in Australia's climate? It was a fascinating discussion, but I was talking to these guys about climate and climate activism. The Seventh-day Adventist Church have people in the highest level of this climate discussion as well. Because if you think about it, we've talked about their mission being to demonize saturated fats, so it worked to work with groups who wanted to minimize the harms of sugar. That was a great symbiotic relationship. Well, the climate discussion is also similar. because the climate discussion want to demonize animal proteins and fats as well. So we've got key people in this space in the South Pacific working with, and again, I can't remember the name, I'm so sorry, but there's a group that's based in Hawaii and an American group in Hawaii that is liaising with the South Pacific. And they are predominantly Seventh-day Adventist people at a high level being able to have conversations about climate and getting rid of animal proteins and fats. So as I say, the circle just keeps going round and round. It's really fascinating.
Well, Belinda, you're somebody that has pulled back the curtains, looked at the blue zones from all different angles.
Yeah.
What can we hang our hat on in your mind that you've learned from your research that is valid, that these people are doing to increase their lifespan?
I think, to me, the most important thing is a lot of the pillars that the Adventist Church talk about is a lot of that Power 9 roadmap. But it has to be real, and you have to make it work in your community, in your family, in your situation. And can we get back to creating and sourcing foods locally and seasonally? Can we think about that? And it takes time, Jessie. In Tassie, Gary and I are very, very lucky. We live in this beautiful community that has a lot of local seasonal resources. Again, we don't have a lot of predators. We don't have foxes or wolves or anything to attack a lot of the animals on this island. The amount of chemical inputs are less, and where we have an opportunity to eat eggs. I mean, we have our own chickens, but in Tasmania, we have opportunity to eat eggs from chickens that free range in the mountains. It's not high mountains, we don't have lots of snow, but they're in the mountains, just walking around, eating insects and doing all these things. So we are lucky compared to, say, somewhere like New York City, where there's a lot of high-rise, there's a lot of people living in a small area, there's not a lot of options to cook your own meals in the same way as we have here. But it's finding places that potentially are doing those things. They're using animal proteins and fats. They're working out how to preserve foods, and they're not using seed oils. I think that's one of the big things. If you can start to decrease refined sugar, if you can pull away from the refined processed seed oils, and you can try to eat nourishing food that we've evolved to eat, try and get away from as much processed food as possible, understanding that there's moral gymnastics in whatever we do. You know, in winter, Gary and I will buy a tin of tomatoes if we need them, but they're not highly processed. So again, it's not about making expectations for people that they can't achieve. It's about doing the best you can with what you have to offer, I guess.
As we close here, somebody to this point who has been highly invested in blue zones, reading the books, eating the meals, maybe going on a retreat, and they're feeling like their foundation is now rocked hearing this new information, what would you say to them?
I'm sorry, but it's the truth. It's very confronting. It's very hard. And I think I mentioned that in my last talk with you, that uncovering these things, actually, it confronted me emotionally, but it confronted a lot of my values, a lot of my beliefs, my education. And I think this is where we need to keep looking. And as you say, you and I research ourselves to find a lot of these things. You speak to the most amazing people, and I've listened to a number of your interviews and learn from those as well. But it does rock your world. And I have the Australasian Society of Lifestyle Medicine is seriously confronted by my research, by my findings, and they want me to be quiet. But when people are being harmed, when I believe the information isn't being transparent, I can't stop talking, Jessie, just because it's just in me. I just go, this isn't fair. And the more people we have around us, the more people we can look to for support, the bigger the community we can create in this space, things start to change. As Gary said, low-carb beer, there's about 8 different types of low-carb beer you can get here in Australia now. The market changes when people push for change. So Harvey Wiley was a chemist and working on the Poison Squad back in the early 1900s, and his big mission was to get cocaine out of Coca-Cola, caffeine and cocaine. And he tried everything, and it didn't matter where he was blocked, whether it was upper house, lower house, or whatever you call it, in American politics. He just kept being blocked at different levels, even though he'd get some support at one level, it just couldn't get through. And he threw his hands up in the end, and he went and worked for a women's magazine. This is a highly qualified professional food chemist. And he just said, I need to go to the people. And so he wrote to the women, to the mothers who were purchasing the food. And he explained to them what was in this product, what was in other products that were being hidden at the time. And I believe, and again, the number, we'll say 20,000, but it could have been more, women marched on Congress to demand that Coca-Cola get rid of caffeine and cocaine. They reduced it because of public pressure, not because of Congress. So this is where I think we do have an opportunity to make a difference.
Since you made it to the end of this clip, I know you're going to love the full episode. Click here to watch. I'll see you over there.
I decided to go even further back after understanding that Ansel Keys was using a lot of his data from a guy called Leland Orber, who'd gone to Crete in 1948 with the Rockefeller Foundation. They had wanted to see what was